What happens when an alien officer trained to maintain peace across galaxies makes a grave mistake on Earth? One slap to a human child sets off a series of events that no one could have predicted. Follow the story of Zex Terrill, a seasoned diplomat from a distant planet, as he learns the true meaning of empathy, connection, and humanity, lessons that could change the fate of intergalactic diplomacy forever. Are you ready to discover how one alien's mistake turns into the greatest lesson of his life? Stay tuned, because this story will take you beyond the stars and into the heart of what makes us human. The Galactic Peacekeeping Corps had always prided itself on its impeccable discipline, flawless procedures, and complete understanding of interstellar protocols. For millennia, they had traveled from one corner of the galaxy to another, keeping peace between countless species, mediating conflicts, and ensuring that no war escalated beyond its rightful boundaries. Their uniforms were pressed to perfection, their reports filed with precision, and their understanding of the galaxy utterly detached from the complexities of the beings they were meant to protect and govern. The latest stop on their diplomatic tour was Earth, a small blue-green planet in a distant solar system. They had studied it carefully, the briefing documents painting Earth as a primitive world with sentient beings barely rising above their natural instincts. Yet, despite its primitive status, Earth had earned a place on the list of civilizations the Corps must interact with. And so, the delegation of 6 highly trained peacekeepers, led by Commander Vilnak, made their way to this foreign world with the same air of detached superiority they had carried for millennia. As the shuttle descended towards Earth, Commander Nak adjusted his ceremonial medals, which jingled together like a collection of expensive wind chimes. He beamed with pride. Species 42J shows remarkable adaptability and unexpected technological advancement, he droned, his voice calm and professional. His fellow officers nodded in agreement, their head crests bobbing with practiced diplomatic grace. They had studied the humans and their history of war, poverty, and the recent technological boom. Still, they had no real understanding of the beings they were about to encounter. Officer Zex Terrill, however, did not share the same enthusiasm. Zex, a veteran of 67 cycles in the Corps, was famous for his insubordination and sarcastic remarks. The 3 eyes that adorned his face rolled simultaneously, a feat only he could manage, and one that had earned him numerous reprimands, but no promotions. "Yes, we know," he muttered under his breath. "We've all read the same briefing materials you've been regurgitating for the past 3 space hours." Zex's words barely registered with the commander, who continued his analysis of the briefing. "Humans are bizarre creatures," he said, his tone almost clinical. "They spend 1/3 of their lives unconscious, they poison themselves voluntarily for recreation, and they believe their solar system is somehow significant to the cosmos." Lieutenant M.V. Locks, eager to show off her vast knowledge, added, "Actually, humans exhibit a form of pack bonding that extends beyond their biological offspring. They form emotional attachments to almost every juvenile in their species, even to the young of other species." Zex's voice broke in again, dripping with sarcasm. "How terribly inefficient, evolutionarily speaking." The commander merely nodded, a sign of agreement that didn't go beyond the surface. "Fascinating," he replied, his enthusiasm as hollow as the cosmos itself. "Now let us proceed with our standard diplomatic protocol. We land, we exchange pleasantries with their leaders, we observe their quaint customs, and we leave before we catch whatever makes them so human." The shuttle touched down with a hiss of steam, a dramatic effect designed to awe and impress the primitive species below. The delegation, their exoskeletons gleaming in the Earth's sunlight, descended in a perfectly synchronized manner, each movement part of the carefully rehearsed diplomatic ritual. As the ramp lowered, the human officials stepped forward, their hands extended in the traditional greeting gesture of their species. Commander Vilnak reciprocated with a 7-tentacle salute, completely unaware that in the 3 galactic civilizations, this gesture would be seen as obscene. But the delegation did not notice the subtle glances exchanged among the human officials. The proceedings seemed to be going smoothly until something unexpected happened. From the crowd, a small human child, no older than 5 Earth cycles, ducked under the security barriers and ran straight toward Officer Zex Terrill. Her face was lit with innocent wonder, hands reaching out toward his shimmering ceremonial armor. The sight was entirely unanticipated, and the officer's instincts took over. Time seemed to slow as Zex, startled by the sudden movement, reacted automatically. His hand moved with swift precision. In an instant, the child was slapped across the face. It was not hard by galactic standards. Merely a light tap, just enough to disorient a creature the size of a Thaxian pouncer. But for the human child, it was like being hit by a freight train. The slap echoed in the stillness of the moment, followed by a sharp cry that seemed to reverberate through the very fabric of diplomatic relations. The child stumbled back, tears streaming down her face as a trickle of blood appeared from a split lip. Her scream was primal, raw, and anguished, an unfiltered expression of fear and pain. The crowd went silent. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the air as the weight of the situation dawned on everyone present. Then something began to shift. The human expressions, once carefully polite and welcoming, turned cold, almost primal. The air itself seemed to charge with an energy that transcended diplomacy. Zex, realizing the enormity of his mistake, took a single nervous step back. It wasn't the first time he had made a misstep in his career, but it was undoubtedly the most disastrous. "I was merely following standard protocol," Zex stammered, trying to justify his actions, but his words were weak, useless in the face of the growing fury in the crowd. "For unexpected proximity breaches, we're instructed to." Before he could finish, the child's parent stepped forward, a towering figure that suddenly seemed far more threatening than Zex had anticipated. The human's calm demeanor only added to the terror in the air. "You hit my kid," the parent said, each word a declaration, simple and undeniable. The calmness in the human's voice was not reassuring. It was terrifying. The same calmness you would hear from a predator explaining the inevitability of their next meal. And as Zex stared into the unblinking eyes of the human, he realized with a sinking feeling that this would not be handled like any other diplomatic incident. This was not an alien species he could dismiss with polite words and regulation. The human parent's posture was tense, the muscles in their arms flexing like coiled springs. Zex, for the first time, felt a surge of real fear, not from the possibility of an intergalactic conflict, but from the raw, primal fury of a parent protecting their child. The commander, sensing the escalating tension, attempted to salvage the situation. "This is a regrettable misunderstanding," he began, his voice strained. "Officer Zex Terrill will be disciplined according to Corps regulations. But the human parent didn't wait for him to finish. With a smile that was more chilling than any threat, they interrupted, "I don't think that's how this is going to work at all." In that moment, Zex realized that this was no longer a matter of diplomacy. It was a matter of survival, his survival. And as the human parents closed in, their expressions darkening with each passing second, Zex understood one undeniable truth. Humanity was a species that could be weak, naive, and volatile, but when it came to their children, they would tear the galaxy apart to protect them. The atmosphere was thick with tension as the humans stared at the delegation with a mixture of confusion and barely contained anger. The once cordial exchange had disintegrated into a standoff, and the situation was far from what the Galactic Peacekeeping Corps had expected. Commander Vilnak, usually calm and composed, now felt a strange unease gnawing at him. He had encountered countless species, but never had he witnessed such an intense reaction to what in his mind was a minor misunderstanding. "Commander, we must act quickly," Officer Krillvax said, her voice low, eyes darting nervously around the growing crowd. She had been assigned to oversee security, but now her mind raced with questions she had never considered before. What kind of species reacts like this over a child? The humans around them were no longer just observing. They were closing in, their expressions hardening with every second that passed. The parents of the child, still glaring at Zex, seemed to be the center of the storm, but it was clear that their anger was shared by every human present. Even the official diplomats, those who had been trained to maintain a perfect facade of neutrality, were showing signs of distress. Zex could feel the eyes of the humans boring into him, their gaze piercing and relentless. The feeling was unfamiliar, and it made him uneasy. For someone who had traveled across galaxies and faced hostile species with far more dangerous weapons, this was new. This was raw, human emotion, and it felt more potent than any laser or explosive. Commander Vilnac stepped forward, attempting to regain control of the situation. His antennae twitched, signaling his frustration. "This is a diplomatic incident," he declared, his voice betraying no hint of fear, though his mind was racing. "We must stay calm and proceed with the protocol." The humans, however, were no longer interested in protocol. The father of the child took a slow step forward, his gaze unwavering. His towering form cast a long shadow over the delegation. "I don't care about your protocols," he said, his voice low but filled with an undeniable strength. "You hurt my child. You apologize. Now." The commander's antennae drooped, and he found himself at a loss for words. This was beyond diplomacy, beyond anything they had prepared for. Zex's mind was spinning. He had followed the manual, the very regulations designed to handle unexpected proximity breaches. But he had forgotten one key detail. He wasn't dealing with just another alien species. He was dealing with humans. The mother of the child stepped forward, her expression filled with quiet fury. "You'll make this right," she stated simply, her tone carrying an authority that Zex had never imagined a human could possess. There was no room for negotiation in her voice. She wasn't asking for an apology, she was demanding one. Zex, for the first time in his long career, felt completely powerless. He had been trained to handle hostile situations with strength and reason, but this was different. This was not a battlefield. This was not a political meeting. This was something far more primal, and he had misjudged it completely. The child, still sniffling, stood behind her parents, clutching her lip with small, trembling hands. Zex's heart sank as he saw the bloodstain on the child's face, a stark reminder of his mistake. He had meant no harm, but his actions had caused real pain. And for the first time, he wondered what kind of damage this might do, not just to his career, but to the reputation of the entire Galactic Peacekeeping Corps. The commander, seeing the situation spiraling further out of control, tried again. "This will be dealt with," he said, his voice wavering slightly. "We will offer our apology, and Officer Zex Terrill will be reassigned. We'll compensate for the injury." But the father of the child shook his head slowly, his eyes narrowing. "Compensation doesn't fix this," he said quietly. "You've crossed a line. An apology isn't enough." Zex's heart raced. What else did they want? What else could he do? In the growing silence, a new voice entered the scene. It was a human, someone who had remained silent until now. This person wasn't part of the official diplomatic group, but their presence was commanding, and every eye in the vicinity turned toward them. "I'm the mediator," the human said, stepping forward with a calm but unwavering expression. "We don't need your apology. We need understanding." The way the mediator spoke with such quiet authority made it clear they held power in this situation, even if they wore no uniform and carried no rank. The mediator's words seemed to hang in the air. "You've made a grave mistake, but it's not just about what you did. It's about what you don't understand. You've threatened something precious to us, something that, to us, is worth more than all your advanced technology, more than your fleets or your starships." Zex had no words. What was this? What did they mean? "We'll handle this," the mediator continued. "But understand this. You've just learned the first rule of interacting with humans. Touch one of our children, and you will witness a force more powerful than anything you've ever encountered. The humans began to murmur among themselves, their faces still hard but no longer full of rage. Zex could see their anger was being channeled into something else, something cold, something terrifying. The mediator's words were starting to sink in. He had made a fatal mistake, and now he would learn the true nature of human protection, of how they would go to unimaginable lengths to shield their young. The mediator looked at Zex, then at the commander, and nodded. "We'll discuss appropriate reparations and cultural exchange programs. But understand this is not something that will go away quietly. It will be dealt with, and this incident will be an example for all of you." Zex's heart pounded. He had thought he knew everything there was to know about diplomacy. But he had just been introduced to something far deeper than politics or negotiation. He had learned the hard way what it truly meant to be human, and this was only the beginning. The room where the humans had brought the delegation was stark and cold, with walls that seemed to absorb the sound of every footstep. It was not a place for pleasantries or diplomacy. The silence felt suffocating, heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. As they were escorted inside, Zex could feel his pulse quicken, his thoughts racing with fear and confusion. He had never been in a situation like this before, not once in his 67 cycles of service. The mediator, still standing calmly, gestured for the delegation to sit. "We need to make sure this doesn't escalate," the mediator said, their voice firm but measured. "I understand that your culture is built on protocols, but this situation cannot be handled by any protocol you've ever studied." Zex found himself seated in a chair that seemed far too small for his three-eyed, six-limbed body. The humans had prepared the space deliberately, a room designed to make the visitors feel out of place, a subtle but potent reminder that they were the ones in control. Zex shifted uncomfortably, his eyes scanning the humans in the room, trying to understand who held the power here. His gaze flicked to the human diplomat who had spoken earlier, the one who had seemed to hold authority even though their clothes were simple and their demeanor unassuming. They were watching him intently, as though waiting for something, perhaps an apology, perhaps something more. "We will begin with a formal apology," the mediator said, breaking the silence. "Not because we are satisfied with your apology, but because you need to learn the human way of resolving conflict." Zex swallowed hard. The words hung in the air, unsettling him. He had always believed that power lay in strength, in protocol, in authority. But here, on this primitive planet, he was beginning to realize that the power was not in any of those things. It was in the connections humans formed, connections that were deeper than anything he had ever encountered. "Apologies are meaningless without understanding," the mediator continued. "So before we move forward, Officer Zex Terrill, I need you to understand what you've done." Zex straightened, his three eyes blinking nervously. The weight of the situation hit him with full force. His mind raced back to the moment when he had slapped the child. It had been an instinct, a reflexive action, an action he had been trained for, an action that made sense to him in his species' terms. He had been taught that any sudden proximity to an unfamiliar being, especially a young one, could be dangerous. In his mind, it was the logical response. But logic, he now realized, had no place in this situation. The mediator's eyes softened for a moment, as if sensing the turmoil in Zex's mind. "You see, humans are different from other species. We are not bound by the same instincts that guide other creatures. We do not act out of fear or reflex when it comes to our children. We act out of love, out of protection. What you did was not just an attack on a child, it was an attack on a deeply held belief, a sacred trust." Zex felt a knot tighten in his chest. The mediator's words were beginning to make sense, but the understanding was like a heavy stone sinking into the pit of his stomach. He had not just slapped a child, he had struck at the very core of human society. He had touched something far more important to them than mere diplomacy. "And now," the mediator continued, their voice gaining strength, "you will learn how to repair this breach. You will learn about us. Not as diplomats, not as subjects of study, but as human beings, with all our complexities and contradictions. Only then will we begin to heal." Zex closed his eyes for a moment, his mind reeling with the enormity of the task before him. He had been prepared for many things in his career, diplomatic crises, hostile encounters, even the occasional assassination attempt. But this was different. This was about understanding. It was about connecting, not controlling. And that scared him more than anything he had ever faced. He opened his eyes, meeting the mediator's gaze. "What do you want me to do?" The mediator gave him a thin smile, almost imperceptible, but it was there, like a flicker of hope in a storm. "You will serve your penance, Officer Zex Terrill, but more than that, you will learn how to become part of something bigger than yourself. We will teach you our ways, through the lens of our children, and once you understand that, only then will you be allowed to leave this planet." The silence that followed was deafening. Zex's mind struggled to comprehend the gravity of the mediator's words. He had imagined his future as a soldier, a diplomat, or an officer of the Peacekeeping Corps. But now, it seemed he was being offered something entirely different, a chance to understand humanity in a way no alien officer had before. The following days passed in a blur. Zex found himself at the heart of human life, among their children. It was not a place he had ever expected to be, and certainly not a place he had ever imagined himself learning anything of value. But as the days wore on, he began to see humanity in a new light. He was assigned to coach a little league baseball team, a task that felt both absurd and overwhelming. He had no knowledge of human sports, let alone baseball, but the mediator had insisted. "This is where you will learn, Officer Zex," they had said. "The children's games are more than just play. They are life itself." At first, Zex thought it was all ridiculous. A game? A simple game of sticks and balls? How could this teach him anything about the complexities of human nature? But as the children ran around the dusty field, their faces lit with joy and frustration, Zex began to realize that there was something here that he could not dismiss. The children's determination, their ability to fall, get up, and try again was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was raw, unrefined, and yet it held an undeniable beauty. For the first time in his life, Zex found himself watching human behavior with wonder, trying to understand the deeper meaning behind their actions. And then, something unexpected happened. One of the children, a small girl with a missing tooth, walked up to him after a particularly frustrating practice. She had struck out several times and was clearly upset, but instead of storming off or giving up, she looked at Zex, her eyes full of determination. "I'll get it next time," she said simply. Zex, in a rare moment of clarity, found himself nodding. He didn't understand it, but he could feel it. Something deep inside him shifted. This wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about resilience. It was about the willingness to keep going, no matter the odds. And as the practice ended and the children ran off the field with smiles on their faces, Zex realized that this was what humanity was all about. The bonds they formed through their shared struggles, their willingness to fight for something bigger than themselves, it was all so human. The days melted into one another, and each one felt like a lesson that Zex never expected to learn. He had come to Earth thinking he would perform a simple diplomatic duty, extend his species' influence, and move on. But now, he was immersed in the complexity of human life, specifically the way they raised their children, how they struggled together, and the resilience they displayed in the face of every failure. Zex could not stop thinking about it. The more he interacted with the children, the more he began to see a side of humanity that went beyond their primitive technology or their seemingly irrational behaviors. It was their emotional depth, their connection to one another, and their incredible capacity to adapt, learn, and grow that began to intrigue him. Zex's thoughts were interrupted one morning when the coach, a woman who had taken on the difficult task of overseeing the team, approached him after practice. She was the one who had first introduced him to the game of baseball, and she had observed his evolution over the past few weeks with a mixture of amusement and something more. She seemed to see something in him that even he hadn't yet recognized. "Zex," she said, her voice more serious than usual, "I've been watching you. You've been learning more than you realize. But there's still a piece missing." She paused for a moment, her eyes narrowing as if measuring his response. "The kids, they see you as their coach, but what you need to understand is that they also need you to see them, not just as players, but as people. Real people with feelings, fears, and dreams. You can teach them how to play the game, but they want more from you than just that." Zex looked at her, confused. He had been trying to understand human behavior through the lens of baseball, but it seemed there was more to it than that. "What do you mean? Isn't it enough to teach them how to play, to show them how to succeed?" The coach shook her head, the corners of her mouth curling into a knowing smile. "It's not about success, Zex. Not really. It's about the effort, the willingness to get back up after you fall. You've learned that, right? But you also need to understand the other side, the emotional side. The kids need someone who will listen to them, who will understand their struggles, and who will help them through their fears." Zex felt a pang of discomfort at her words. He had been so focused on teaching them the mechanics of the game, the rules, the precision of their throws, the technique of their swings. He had forgotten that baseball wasn't just a game for them. It was a way for them to express themselves, to connect with each other and with the world around them. That afternoon, as he watched the children practice, he saw something he had missed before. The child who had been upset after striking out was back, her face set with determination. But there was something different now. The other kids were gathered around her, offering encouragement, giving advice, and laughing together. Zex realized in that moment that it wasn't about being the best player, it was about being part of something bigger, something that went beyond the field. The coach was right. The children needed more than just instruction. They needed to feel understood. They needed to know that they mattered. The next day, during practice, Zex tried something new. He wasn't sure why, but something deep inside him urged him to change his approach. Instead of focusing solely on the technical aspects of the game, he began to engage with the children in a different way. He asked them about their lives, about their fears, their dreams, and their struggles. At first, they were hesitant, but as Zex's genuine curiosity shone through, they began to open up. One by one, they shared stories of their families, their hopes, and even their failures. Zex was surprised by how easily the children shared their thoughts and feelings. He had expected them to shy away, to avoid revealing too much, but instead, they spoke with a vulnerability that struck him to the core. He found himself listening, not just as a coach, but as a fellow being, trying to understand what made them tick. He began to realize that these children, with their simple desires and raw emotions, were not so different from him. They had their own battles, their own vulnerabilities, and yet they were stronger than he had ever imagined. One day after practice, Zex found himself sitting next to the same child who had struck out all those weeks ago. She was sitting alone, looking down at the dirt in front of her, lost in thought. Zex approached her cautiously, not sure what to say, but feeling the need to connect. "You're doing better," he said, his voice softer than usual. "You're getting there." She didn't look up at him immediately, but then slowly, she nodded. "Yeah, but sometimes I just don't think I'm good enough. I'm scared I'll never be good enough." Zex's heart tightened as he listened. He had heard these words before, in the many battles and diplomatic missions he had been a part of, but never from someone so small, so innocent. He knew the weight of failure. He had felt it in his own life, though he had never expressed it the way this child had. He knew the feeling of being inadequate, of being overwhelmed by expectations. But what he had never realized was that these emotions were universal. "You are good enough," Zex said, his voice steady, though inside he was grappling with his own doubts. "You don't have to be perfect. The game isn't about being perfect. It's about trying and trying again when you fall." The child looked up at him, her face softening. "But what if I fail again?" Zex felt a flicker of something deep inside him. Something that had never been part of his training, something that only the humans could teach him. Failure doesn't mean you've lost. It means you've learned. And the more you fail, the more you learn how to succeed. The child blinked, considering his words. For the first time, she smiled. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And in that moment, Zex felt something shift within him. He wasn't just teaching the children baseball anymore. He was teaching them how to live, how to keep going when the world told them to stop, how to keep swinging, no matter how many times they missed. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, Zex stood in the middle of the field, watching the children play. The laughter, the shouts of encouragement, the sound of bat meeting ball, it all felt like something more than just a game. It was a lesson in resilience, in connection, and in the very essence of what it meant to be human. And Zex realized with a sudden clarity that this was why he had been sent here. Not to solve a diplomatic crisis, not to fix a broken protocol, but to learn from the humans, to learn about themselves and about the strength they carried inside. He had thought he understood them, but now he was beginning to see what truly made them special. The following days blurred together, each practice session revealing new layers of humanity to Zex. He had thought that teaching baseball was simply a means of fulfilling his diplomatic duty, but it had become something much more. The children had shown him a side of themselves that was raw and real, and in return, he had begun to see their world in a new light. Zex spent his time observing how the children not only honed their baseball skills, but also how they learned to work together. Despite their differences, their mistakes, and their frustrations, they never gave up. They supported one another, cheering when someone succeeded, offering encouragement when someone failed. Zex, once an outsider, began to realize that this sense of camaraderie, this bond they shared, was something that transcended the game itself. It was about life, about connection. And that was something Zex had never fully understood. But even as he began to see the value of teamwork, Zex still struggled with something deeper, his past mistake. The slap. No matter how many times he had apologized, it still weighed heavily on him. The child he had struck had forgiven him, but Zex couldn't shake the feeling that he had not yet earned their full trust. He had crossed a line, and no simple apology could undo that. One afternoon, as the team gathered to start practice, Zex noticed the boy who had been the most affected by the incident, the one who had shown the greatest hesitation at first, approaching him. This boy, once filled with fear and doubt, now walked toward him with a determination that Zex had never seen before. "Coach Zex," the boy said, his voice quiet but firm, "I wanted to thank you for teaching me. I know I've failed a lot, but I'm not going to give up anymore." Zex was taken aback by the boy's words. He had expected anger, perhaps, or resentment, but instead, the boy was offering gratitude, a willingness to keep going despite everything. Zex crouched down to the boy's level, his three eyes focusing on the child. "You've done more than just try. You've learned that failure doesn't mean the end. It means there's always another chance. And I'm proud of you for not giving up." The boy nodded, a small but genuine smile crossing his face. "I won't give up, I promise." Zex felt a warmth spread through him, something he hadn't expected to feel: pride. The connection between them had shifted. He had not only taught the boy a lesson in baseball, but a lesson in life. And in doing so, he had learned something about himself as well. Later that day, as the children celebrated a particularly hard-earned win, Zex stood to the side, watching them interact with their families. He realized that for the first time in his life, he felt truly connected to a group of people. Not as a diplomat, not as an officer, but as someone who had shared their struggles, their failures, and their triumphs. The lessons he had learned from them were not just about baseball. They were about humanity, about the strength to keep going, about the power of empathy and forgiveness, and about how bonds are built through shared experiences. And though Zex had come to Earth to teach and uphold peace, he realized that the humans were teaching him something far more valuable: how to truly understand and connect with another being. That evening, as Zex sat on the sidelines watching the children finish up their practice, his mind raced with the implications of what he had learned. This was what he had been missing all along. This was the key to understanding humanity. It wasn't their technology, their politics, or even their survival instincts. It was their capacity for empathy, for connection, for the willingness to help one another no matter the cost. Zex's thoughts were interrupted by a small voice calling his name. He looked up to see the little girl who had struggled so much at the beginning of their training. She was standing in front of him, holding a baseball in her hands. "Coach Zex?" she said, her voice hesitant but hopeful. "Can I ask you something?" Zex smiled softly, his heart swelling with an unfamiliar warmth. "Of course," he said, his voice gentler than it had ever been before. The girl looked down at the baseball in her hands, twirling it nervously. I was wondering, do you ever get scared?" Zex blinked, taken aback by the question. He had never been asked something like that. But as he looked at the child's innocent face, he realized that she wasn't asking about the fear of danger or battle. She was asking about the fear of failure, the fear of not being good enough. He thought for a moment, remembering the countless challenges he had faced as a soldier, as a diplomat. "Yes," he said quietly, "I'm scared too. Sometimes, when everything feels like it's falling apart, I get scared." The girl looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and understanding. "But you don't give up, right?" Zex paused. For a long moment, he wasn't sure what to say. But then, slowly, he nodded. "No, I don't give up, and neither should you." The child smiled, her face lighting up with a newfound sense of determination. She threw the ball up in the air, catching it with a triumphant grin. "I won't," she said. "I'll keep trying." Zex watched her, feeling a deep sense of pride swell in his chest. He hadn't just taught her how to play baseball. He had taught her how to be human. And in doing so, he had learned something about himself. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow across the field, Zex stood up and walked over to the group of children who were now huddled together, chatting excitedly. He joined them, feeling the bond growing stronger with each passing moment. They were no longer just his students. They were his team. They were his family. And for the first time in his life, Zex understood what it truly meant to belong. That evening, as Zex sat on the sidelines watching the children finish up their practice, his mind raced with the implications of what he had learned. This was what he had been missing all along. This was the key to understanding humanity. It wasn't their technology, their politics, or even their survival instincts. It was their capacity for empathy, for connection, for the willingness to help one another no matter the cost. Zex's thoughts were interrupted by a small voice calling his name. He looked up to see the little girl who had struggled so much at the beginning of their training. She was standing in front of him, holding a baseball in her hands. "Coach Zex," she said, her voice hesitant but hopeful. "Can I ask you something?" Zex smiled softly, his heart swelling with an unfamiliar warmth. "Of course," he said, his voice gentler than it had ever been before. The girl looked down at the baseball in her hands, twirling it nervously. I was wondering, do you ever get scared?" Zex blinked, taken aback by the question. He had never been asked something like that. But as he looked at the child's innocent face, he realized that she wasn't asking about the fear of danger or battle. She was asking about the fear of failure, the fear of not being good enough. He thought for a moment, remembering the countless challenges he had faced as a soldier, as a diplomat. "Yes," he said quietly. "I'm scared too. Sometimes when everything feels like it's falling apart, I get scared." The girl looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and understanding. "But you don't give up, right?" Zex paused. For a long moment, he wasn't sure what to say, but then slowly he nodded. "No, I don't give up, and neither should you." The child smiled, her face lighting up with a newfound sense of determination. She threw the ball up in the air, catching it with a triumphant grin. "I won't," she said. "I'll keep trying." Zex watched her, feeling a deep sense of pride swell in his chest. He hadn't just taught her how to play baseball. He had taught her how to be human. And in doing so, he had learned something about himself. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow across the field, Zex stood up and walked over to the group of children who were now huddled together, chatting excitedly. He joined them, feeling the bond growing stronger with each passing moment. They were no longer just his students. They were his team. They were his family. And for the first time in his life, Zex understood what it truly meant to belong. The days that followed felt like a slow, methodical unraveling of everything Zex had known about himself, his species, and his place in the galaxy. It wasn't just the human children he had begun to understand. It was humanity itself. Every moment spent with them, every lesson learned on the baseball field had subtly yet profoundly shifted something deep within him. He found himself waking up earlier each morning, eager to see the children, like to witness their growth and their resilience. There was a new softness in him, a tenderness he hadn't expected. He no longer viewed his role as merely a peacekeeper or a diplomat. Those titles, once the cornerstone of his identity, now felt shallow in comparison to the experiences he was having with the humans. Zex's days had become more than just teaching baseball. They had become about teaching, learning, and growing together. He had watched the children fail, watched them stumble and fall, and yet they had never given up. The idea of failure, so feared and avoided in his own species, seemed almost irrelevant to these young humans. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about pushing through, about getting up no matter how many times they fell, and about understanding that each failure was just another step toward improvement. But this realization didn't come without struggle. Zex still carried the weight of his past actions, of the slap he had dealt to the child that fateful day. The image of the child's tear-streaked face haunted him at night. He knew the apology had been necessary, but it felt like a small gesture in comparison to the emotional debt he had yet to repay. Despite the fact that the child had forgiven him, Zex felt as though he had not yet earned their trust completely. One afternoon, as the team gathered after a particularly intense practice, the child who had been slapped approached Zex. She stood before him, her eyes wide and serious. It was the first time she had directly come to him without a smile or a playful comment. This time, there was something different about her expression, something that Zex had learned to recognize as the human ability to be vulnerable. "Coach Zex," she said, her voice steady but small. "I wanted to ask you something." Zex knelt down so that he could be at her eye level. His 3 eyes studied her face, noticing the way her hands fidgeted nervously at her sides. "What is it?" he asked, his voice soft, encouraging. The child hesitated before speaking again. "I know you're sorry, and I know you didn't mean to hurt me, but do you promise that you'll never hurt me again? Never hurt any of us?" The question struck Zex like a lightning bolt. He hadn't expected it. It was simple, but it cut to the core of his guilt, his doubts, and his desire to make things right. His heart sank as he looked into her trusting eyes. This was the moment he had feared. The moment where his past actions had the potential to undo everything he had worked to rebuild. Zex swallowed, his voice heavy with sincerity. "I swear to you," he said, his words carrying more weight than any formal apology could ever have. "I will never hurt you or any of your friends again. You have my word." For a brief moment, the child stared at him as if weighing his sincerity. Then, slowly, she nodded and offered him a smile, a real, genuine smile. "Okay. I believe you, Coach." It was in that moment that Zex felt something inside him break and then heal. The pain of his past mistake, the weight of the guilt that had hung over him, seemed to dissolve in the face of this child's forgiveness. It wasn't just about making promises. It was about learning how to make them with sincerity and how to live up to them. From that day forward, something in Zex changed. He wasn't just their coach anymore. He wasn't just the alien outsider trying to understand human nature. He was part of something bigger, a part of their community, their world, and most importantly, their journey. He began to see the children not just as students or players, but as young beings with the potential to shape the future in ways that he couldn't even comprehend. And he, in turn, had something to offer them, something far more valuable than baseball skills or diplomatic training. He had the ability to help them understand that even in their struggles, they were not alone. One day after practice, Zex found himself sitting alone on the edge of the field, watching the children laugh and play. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the grass. The air was warm, filled with the sound of excited chatter. For the first time, Zex felt at peace. It wasn't the kind of peace he had known as a peacekeeper, where everything was ordered and controlled. No, this was a different kind of peace, one that was born from the chaos of human emotion, of relationships, of failure and redemption. As he sat there, reflecting on everything he had learned, he realized that this was exactly where he was meant to be. Not on the battlefield, not in the command center of the Galactic Peacekeeping Corps, but right here, with these children, in this moment. He had come to Earth to enforce peace, to mediate conflicts, to represent his species. But in doing so, he had discovered a deeper truth. Peace wasn't something you could enforce. It was something you earned, something you built with trust, with understanding. It was then that he understood. The humans had never been about their weapons or their technology, their systems of government or their mighty fleets. They were about the connections they forged with each other, the bonds they created through the simplest of acts. And those bonds, those connections, were stronger than any weapon in the galaxy. The realization came slowly, but it hit him with the force of a comet crashing into a planet. Zex had come here to teach, but he was the one who had been taught. And now, he was ready to share what he had learned, not with formal speeches or reports, but with the very core of what it meant to be human. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Zex stood up, feeling something he had never felt before. He was not alone, and he never would be again. The final chapter arrived like the end of a long, arduous journey. For Zex Terrill, it felt like the culmination of everything he had learned about humanity, their resilience, their strength, their unwavering commitment to each other. But it was also a reminder that no journey truly ends. Instead, it transforms into something new. And for Zex, this transformation was not one he had expected when he first arrived on Earth, nor had he anticipated the deep personal growth he would undergo. It was game day. The day that had once seemed like just another part of his punishment, something to check off his list of responsibilities, had now become something much more. The children's Little League game, which Zex had initially dismissed as a trivial event, had grown into a symbol of the very lessons he had come to learn. He stood now, not as an outsider observing, but as a coach, someone who was part of this community, a participant in the shared struggle that connected all humans. Zex stood at the edge of the field, watching the children gather, their faces filled with anticipation and excitement. Their parents were seated in the stands, cheering with an energy that Zex had never seen in any other species. He observed the way the humans interacted with each other, how they rallied behind their young, their voices booming with encouragement, their smiles wide with pride. There was no judgment here, no competition for status or power, just a shared belief in the importance of the moment, in the connection that each person, each child, brought to the game. Zex had spent the last few weeks teaching them how to play, not just baseball, but how to face challenges and failure, and in turn, they had taught him more than he could have ever imagined. In the quiet moments between practices, they had taught him the value of empathy, of listening, of being vulnerable and open. The parents, who had initially watched him with suspicion, had slowly accepted him into their fold, seeing in him not just an alien diplomat, but a fellow being struggling to learn and grow. And the children, each of them in their own way, had shown him that strength didn't come from perfection, but from the willingness to keep trying, even when the odds were stacked against you. As the game began, Zex stood on the sidelines, feeling a sense of calm he had never experienced before. He wasn't just a coach anymore. He wasn't just a soldier, bound by duty. He was part of something bigger. He was part of these children's journey, part of their world. And for the first time, he realized that in helping them, he had helped himself. The game started with the usual excitement, the sound of the bat striking the ball echoing through the field. Zex watched the children run the bases, their small legs carrying them with determination despite the mistakes they made along the way. There was no perfection in their play. Some missed catches, others struck out. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that they were playing. They were trying. They were pushing themselves, learning to fall and get back up again. And then, something unexpected happened. One of the children, a shy boy who had struggled the most during practices, took his turn at bat. Zex had seen him falter many times before, his hands trembling, his face clouded with doubt. But today was different. The boy stepped up to the plate with a new confidence in his stance. Zex watched as the boy gripped the bat, his eyes focused, his entire being intent on the ball. The pitcher released it, and with a swing that Zex had never seen from him before, the boy made contact. The sound of the bat connecting with the ball was like music to Zex's ears. The ball soared through the air, faster and farther than any of them had expected. The crowd erupted into cheers, but Zex's attention was solely on the boy, who stood frozen for a moment, his mouth open in disbelief. Then, with a burst of excitement, the boy took off running, his legs pumping with all the energy he could muster. Zex felt his heart race in time with the boy's strides. This wasn't just a baseball game. This was a moment of triumph, a moment where failure had been overcome, a moment where belief in oneself had won out over doubt. The boy made it to first base, then second, and as he rounded third, the crowd went wild. When the boy finally crossed home plate, his teammates surrounded him, lifting him into the air, their cheers filling the air. The parents, who had been watching with bated breath, erupted into applause. Zex stood there, his eyes wide, feeling a strange emotion flood over him. It was pride, but it wasn't just for the boy, it was for every one of them. For all the children, for all the parents, for every human who had shown him what it meant to be part of something larger than himself. The game ended, and the result was inconsequential. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about the journey, about the effort, and about the connections that had been forged along the way. Zex joined the children in their celebration, feeling a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with victory. For once, he didn't feel like an outsider. He didn't feel like a diplomat or a soldier. He felt like a human. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Zex stood with the children and their parents, his heart light with a feeling he hadn't known existed. The mediator, who had been silently observing from the sidelines, walked up to him, a knowing smile on their face. "You've done well, Officer Terrill," they said, their voice gentle. "You've learned more about humanity than most diplomats could ever hope to." Zex nodded, feeling the truth of the words resonate deep inside him. He had come to Earth with a mission to maintain peace, to represent his species, but in doing so, he had found something far more valuable. He had found the strength of humanity, the way they cared for one another, the way they fought for each other, even when the odds were against them. As the evening wore on and the children played together, their laughter ringing through the warm air, Zex took a deep breath. He had learned a vital lesson, one that he could never have anticipated when he first arrived. He had learned that peace was not about control or authority. It was about understanding, about connection, and about finding a place where you truly belonged. Zex's journey had begun with a slap, a mistake, a misunderstanding, but it had ended with something far greater, the understanding that sometimes the greatest peace comes not from solving conflicts, but from learning to live and grow together. And as he stood there, watching the children and their families, Zex knew that this was the beginning of a new chapter, not just for him, but for the entire Galactic Peacekeeping Corps. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this incredible journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment with your thoughts below. We'd love to hear what you think about this story and how Zex Terrill's transformation resonated with you. If you want more sci-fi stories that explore humanity, emotions, and the unknown, make sure to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Join us next time for more amazing adventures, and thanks for being part of this incredible ride. See you in the next video.